Hey there, Mutiny members. It's come that time for your guys' feedback. So if you're new to this format, inside of the Discord, I extract from the Works in Progress forum or your guys' projects. So if you haven't already, start a project for yourself, get feedback from other members. And I also take the screenshots out of here and just draw over them, giving my 2 cents of experience from the industry. There's a new section to our Discord. So under the members question, you can chuck a question in here, anything about the industry. And then next month, I'm going to be creating a video for you guys on that, just answering all of them. So if anything sort of pops up during the month, make sure you come in here and ask them. Rishab's already started it, asking how to model a mouth bag. So I definitely got you for that one. I potentially might make a video for that, seeing it'll be a useful combination with all the retopology videos. So we'll start with Yamon. I'll try and put your guys' names up here so you can see them in the videos. So this is a cool character. It's nice to see you're keeping up with projects. I think you put this in between something while you're waiting for another rig. So these characters are always nice because you can complete them quite fast. And then you always have something for your portfolio, just sort of freshen up your skills as you're going on. So off the bat, I think you've done very well to actually match the reference and the 2D concept. You followed it pretty good. So everything I see here is reminding me of that 2D reference. My feedback would just be on the case of making it a little bit more accurate and getting used to copying identically what you see. But it might be that you're sort of halfway through this or just looking for the final touches. So the first thing I saw that basically popped out to me was the hand area. So usually the first thing that pops out is proportions of a character. But for this one, it looked pretty good, so pretty identical. But when I came down towards the hands, I did notice that these look a little bit different. So on your one, they're very sharp and realistic and almost a little bit dainty in comparison to the 2D concept. Obviously, these almost look a little bit like talons or like void blades almost. So I think to make an improvement to match your concept better is just try and thicken these up, make them really nice and big and bold. So that'll just be the case of getting, like a move brush and then just expanding and pulling these guys out. Also try and take note of the thickness and the size of certain things. So this guy has really large, big knuckles. And in fact, the actual hand itself, the paw, is quite thick and taking up a lot of space. So you might just want to change this shape. This hand seems to be getting a little bit too long. So first of all, work on the outside, bring everything in. And then once you're happy with that, then you can start to work on the fingers. And then I think it's going to match really well. Yeah, this will be interesting to see if you can get what you're rendering it in, if you have some kind of special shader in Unreal Engine or Marmoset, or if it emits light onto the surface. I think that would be really nice and really cool. On the same sort of theme, it's up to you how accurate you want to be with the angles of the hood. So if we look at this concept, one thing that's very striking on the concept is these angles. And every single angle is just adding a little bit of character, and then it comes down. And even on the center of the hood, these are very sharp. On your sculpt, it's a little softer, so it might be losing the initial character. So you might want to just come in here, use a move brush with Aki Curve, and then just get those silhouettes back. Or just a simple, pinch brush on the tip there, just to sharpen it up. And you can see how it will match this much better. I mean, the most evident one is when you're working on the sides of silhouettes. So if we come on this angle, we can see there's lots of different angles here, but then on the main sculpt, it's pretty flat. So it's just losing a little bit of interest. And then we've got some curvature up here, and the curvature isn't really matching the rest of the sculpt. So you want to keep the language consistent across the model. And I think that's where the improvements can be made. On the concept as well, maybe the interpretation of the shoulder area. So I think there's a little bit of a different kind of equipment here in comparison to the one that you've got on the sculpt. Now, obviously, as a 3D artist, you can sort of interpret the sculpts, and sometimes we have to change them for games. I think it would be a good idea for you to actually use the one that's in the reference here. The reason is because when I was looking at the shoulder areas and the upper arms, there was something about these folds that weren't really selling to me. And also on the front side, the folds didn't seem to integrate very well with this hard asset here. So I think it'd be worth switching it out. And also the added benefit is it's going to be different than the bottom section. So we're going to have a nice level of separation. It's just going to add a little bit more interest and also give you another excuse to do a different substance material. So the 2D artist has done pretty well in separating these. So it's nice in stages. Like there's different colors at each individual level. So 1, 2, 3. So you want to bring that basically back into your sculpt. So 1, 2, 3. Now, in terms of workflow, I'm assuming you want to come and take this in and start painting it. There's this embossed area on the cloth. Now, what you've done is you've decided to have that separate as an actual sculpted element. I think what you would take benefits from is actually just to have this blank on the high poly sculpt. Maybe you're using it just for like a little bit of a reference. It does seem that it's its own floating object. But when you do take it into Substance, I suggest taking that off, because we might want to come in here and adjust this or change the pattern and design. And it does look like it offers itself up well to Substance Designer. We can put like metallic and shine on it. And then you can get really fancy. I know there's other members' videos that I've gone over in terms of Substance Painter anchoring techniques. So we can get some nice embossment on the side. And all those features you basically just can't get once you've hard baked an asset in. The only areas that you would keep are the hard trims that could be geometry. So the corners here, the hard trim, and also the front corner here. So keep those the same and then start to texture this inside of Substance. Yeah, overall really good initial sculpt, really strong angles and stuff. So I'm looking forward to seeing you taking this all the way through. As a final note, I would potentially say just thicken up the book a little bit, just so it's a slightly more meaty on the concept here. It's quite thick in comparison to what I can see on the sculpt. So really make sure that that's popping out. So next up we have DrkSt, and DrkSt is making a character. Sounds like you're very busy and trying to focus on more consistency and enjoying the process, which is obviously easier said than done. But these are nice, sizable projects. I think one of the nice thing about these is you can complete them, close the loop early, have something in your portfolio, and then scale up to something bigger. So again, this is another project where I think you've hit the representation quite fast. Just we need to tighten up a couple of areas so it really pops in your sculpt and it transfers to the end character. So one thing I think is missing on your sculpt when I look at this 2D concept, the 2D concept has a really strong pleated silhouette and it's really popping out at you from a distance. So if we look out, you know, it's coming in and coming out. On the sculpt, it's a little bit flat, and that's usually because of a restriction of how to actually make the pleat. So I suggest just coming in and spending some time on enhancing that silhouette. So, you know, mask a couple of verts, mask a couple of points and pull them downwards. Maybe switch to black and white mode, and then try and match it as close as possible. I think you've managed to match the belts and buckles pretty well. Maybe one thing on the button up here is that it's looking very tight and flat. So in comparison to your sculpt, the holes are opening up a little bit. And then also the inner strand of string itself is quite rounded. So maybe get the pinch tool and just enclose it a little bit more. The benefit of that is when you're sculpting and baking something like this, if everything's a little bit too open when it does bake, you do start to get open hold artifacts, like especially if your low poly isn't matching this perfectly. And also, especially if you have a flat surface for a button. So it's kind of like an optimization top tip where you just really tighten things and close the holes up. While we're in this area, and something that I picked up on as well was the shape language of the hat. So obviously this is basically in the block out phase because I can see the polygons. But when I look on the character itself, she's got these angles, and this will look very pedantic when I pick it up, but it does make a difference, and you'll see it when you change. So the angles of this are going at a certain degree, whereas on your sculpt, it's almost flat where we have hit the angle here. So try and match it just a little bit and just bring out what the 2D concept artist was doing. The benefit with 2D concept artists, and I found this even in my own work and when I'm copying a 2D character artist, is that they're really, really strong at creating silhouettes. So even stronger than I would be. So I really stay true to what they're trying to bring across in the 2D concept. So I really do match it religiously. So yeah, just make that adjustment, bring it out slightly, and I think that'll make it better. The next section is on the character and the pose of posture. So obviously we like to sculpt it quite rigid first and then bring the character out in the posing. But I suggest putting a teeny bit in your sculpt first. So the thing that I see in the 2D concept here is her hip area is moving forwards in 3D space. and then basically the back of her head and her neck is moving back in space. And then this is making not curvature, but it's making a very elongated torso, which translates into a straight spine. So I think that's just a little bit missing here. And also the area around her neck is getting really, really small. So this is all bunching up and closing out. You want to elongate this, make this longer, maybe lift the head up and also take, so if we look at the concept here, there's a lot of free space here, you know, a lot of empty space. You can almost see the back of her hair quite well. And then you can go outwards and just mark some other landmarks. So for example, where the button is compared to her eye, that's quite a long space as well. So she's got a long neck, a long torso and a long head. Whereas here it's actually quite close to each other. You can see the distance from here to here. So it'll involve a lot of different movements. So moving the head, maybe moving and resting the shoulders down a bit, elongating the head, the neck slightly, maybe even moving the torso and her t-shirt down. And then that's going to basically open up this space. While we're around the head area, another important aspect is to really try and match what the material is. So here she looks like a toy-like wooden surface, I guess. So I'd like to see that matched in your brush usage. So right now I can see from the highlights, it looks very soft and curved, almost like it was a toy effect and not a wood. So come in with the trim and start to flatten these areas, especially if I look towards the border. Obviously it's hard to interpret with like an anime style, but I would expect the chin to be really, really sharp, almost like a Pinocchio style. And then also the same with the ear. So lots of arrows here, but in general, just try and get rid of anything that's curvature and then cut it off with a trim. And the same is going to be true for the corners and all across the model really, but the corners of the shoulder here. So you can see how these angles are nice and sharp, even down to the t-shirt. So on your sculpt, I think they're a little bit too rounded. So again, coming in with a polish, maybe sometimes a pinch helps. So if you get the pinch brush and then brush in this direction, it's going to sharpen that up. And then on this top surface, you can start to do a trim, and then that's going to sharpen everything up and look really nice. But yeah, good work so far. I'd like to see you finish this project. Also good to see that you've inserted some colors just to see how everything's scaled against each other. Okay, next up we have Tomtotone. They're doing a superhero character. There wasn't much description left with this, so I don't know what the aim and objective was for the character. I guess it was for practicing. But when I look at the wireframe, I would say that this is definitely not for a game character. So just double check what the outcome is for a sculpt or for a game character, but this definitely can't go into a real-time engine. I think the hair effect you have is nice. Potentially you've followed the hair tutorial where you kind of make a cylinder, rotate it, and then put it down. It does give these nice continuous edges and cavities, which work really well for hair. Because there's so much going on in this, I think what will add to the sculpt is if you split it up a little bit more, because right now it's looking slightly like ice cream that would come out of an ice cream machine. You know, it's consistent all the way through, or like Play-Doh. So the way you would break this up is add some additional strands, you know, ones that are coming off the main ones that can also break it up, or maybe just come in with a sculpt and then start to remove parts of the hair. Ideally, where it comes towards the end, you can just flatten these out. And basically what you're trying to get rid of is the continuous language of many, many lines. So wherever you see all these individual lines going down the hair, just try and break these up in different ways. So that can be with another asset, or it can just be with different brush usage. So the effect with the suit that I think you're going for is that sharpened Spider-Man superhero look. These can always be a little bit tricky, especially because you need to be measuring the size of your bevels and how that's reading, especially if you're baking it, is that going to come across very well? So looking from a distance, I think because the details are so fine and the edges that you've done are so tight, it's actually getting lost from a distance. And the texture here might be confusing things a little bit. So the surface, I'm unsure if it's metal or rubber, and that's getting confused in the shine of the material texture itself. But it's also because there's no subform here. So if this was like a cloth or a leather, I would expect to see a couple of more bony landmarks and definitely some more muscle striations, especially for a heroic character. So yeah, it's just getting a little bit confused. I think around the knee as well. To me, it's reading a lot like an Iron Man suit or like a Spider-Man tech suit, especially with the bevels that you made. But when I do look at that, I can't really see how it's going to be moving when the character's moving, sort of like what the mechanics behind that. So try and revise that, and just remember that this will have to deform. The bend of the knee is going to be coming at 90 degrees almost, and sometimes extended all the way. It's hard to put my finger on it as well. I think others will also be able to assess this. But when I look at the character, my assumption is that the eye's roughly positioned here. And then when we look at these, this Spider-Man shaped, it feels like they're slightly off center. So you might be breaking a little bit of realism there. She might be looking through the corner of the plastic here, and it might be a little bit difficult. But again, I know you're trying to get this elongated effect here. So maybe just draw these, keep this here the same, and then draw these in together. And I think it'll look a little bit more realistic, especially with the positioning of her nose. We can basically assume where her eyes are going to be. And I do believe that's a little bit off. It's a similar sort of theme with the neck. So the neck is one of the most mobile joints. We can twist it, we can bend it. And I think this is falling in the Batman effect, where he's got like a really hard rubber neck, and the actor, when he's doing it, he can't really move around. He has to move his shoulders. And I think this would happen with this character. And when I do look at the character, she's giving off more of like a dexterous, fast vibe. But then when I look at the neck, it seems very tanky and immobile. So maybe just make some adjustments on there, or redefine this to be a very thin material like a rubber. But generally around the neck, we don't want to put too many hard surface elements. If you imagine Iron Man, that's obviously a very complicated area that they've tried to make. They've basically split it up into individual panels as much as possible. Okay, so next up we have DrkSt. I want to say DrkSt. So you're aspiring character concept artist, and your biggest challenge is multi-layered textures, complex character designs, and topology. So yeah, it's an interesting one. It seems that you've done both the 2D concept and the 3D. I'd be interested to see what your focus is on, because we don't really have 3D concept artists in the workflow and in the industry. But it sounds like you're sort of in between the two, maybe potentially thinking about going to characters. I'm not sure. So this is a really cool character. It looks like you've spent a lot of time in putting lots of fidelity and lots of details in there. I know you were saying you were having some troubles with texturing. So that's definitely an area that I can give you some feedback for. It's something that basically popped out. But it's really cool. Nice to see that you've actually done the character concept yourself to basically lay out. I highly suggest that to all character concept artists or character artists. Even if you're not very good at drawing, it's always nice to see how the character is being put together, just for sanity, if anything, just to understand where all your references are going. And it's nice to see you've done a couple of iterations. So in character classes that I teach, we do actually do some drawing and get students in the habit of making multiple characters, even up to, like 24 or something. So it's a cool vibe. It basically reminds me of a little bit of Predator. And so because you've dived in with the full, it's quite a big project, to be honest. And as you haven't really done retopology, you might find in the process that a couple of these areas might be a little bit hard to translate into a game. But that basically all comes with experience. You'll learn through the pain of trying to retop something or make it into a texture that you'll adapt it for the next character. So there's loads of lessons to be learned on this one. So diving straight into the feedback, and I'll touch on sort of like an overall concept of character design and portfolio work. So when I first started to get into characters, I really thought that a lot of detail meant that things would be more impressive. And if there was a lot of technical skill there, then it would make the character good. I slowly learned that basically tracking back a little bit, removing detail and being a bit more refined with it did help me in the long run. So that would be my advice to you to save a little bit of time of like going on that journey of discovery that I did. And the areas in question is basically anywhere where there's high levels of repetition. So while it is cool that there's lots of detail, sometimes it does hurt the viewer's eye and the thematics of the design when there is just too much, especially if it's very evidently repeated. So you can see that a lot in these ones here. And there's multiple ways you can break this up. You can either change the asset itself, you can switch up the texture, but usually it's just a means of removing some of the areas, maybe just like staggering it, introducing some asymmetry. So for example, here we've almost got like an 8-pack of design. maybe there's just a couple that are missing. So maybe that one's missing, or maybe this one's slightly deformed, like longer, because wherever the human eye sees repetition, and I can draw them out everywhere, basically, you'll see continuous patterns all over the place, and the same with the thread. That's what removes from the realism, and the viewers will feel something funny and they won't necessarily know what to put their finger on, but I can guarantee you it's going to be all this repetition all across the place. So to improve this, what I would say is try and find ways to break up and put random elements where you can. It's exactly the same for the texture. So for example, you see this leather panel here. This is just one individual case study. You know, if I look at that single strip, how can we break this up? Let's select some areas, maybe here or maybe here, and just let that rest, or just have a different texture or some damage or some grunge. Same with this sort of area. We've got a continuous tileable texture. Maybe we just tone down the height map in certain locations, or just completely don't have the height map in an area or two. So it's an interesting topic, this. So it far extends to everything when you zoom out. So you'll also have the similar material across the asset. So for example, this bony texture is used in multiple areas. Because it's used so much, you're having a lot of texture overlap, and it's confusing and making the character a little bit chaotic. So the way to fix that is usually in the design or in the change of color. So let's say, for example, the front of the head here that I can just about draw out. I have to actually look very closely to see what it is first. So that's usually not a great sign when you're first doing it. So if I outlining it here, maybe on the background, we can contrast this with like a very hard leather. And I think that would work well. And while it doesn't do the silhouette from the edges, it does give us a little bit of silhouette on the internal lines by just the contrast of the color. And then if you still wanted to have all that bony effect, then we can switch back to the bones and maybe have these on the outside. But you'll see how that basically breaks up the character and lets the eye rest a little bit more. And it's interesting because I look at this character and I actually like the design of it. So for example, this area is resting really well. It's kind of like nice and broad and open, yet there's a slightly higher concentration of detail here. So just lots of bits of variance basically that adapts it and makes it nicer. I also think for example, when I look at the bones, instead of having these all straight like this, maybe some of them can be staggered like that and just angled in all different ways. The fabric as well, we want to avoid the vertical lines that go straight down. Maybe this is caught on something. So for example, it curls around and it's resting, just like that more physicality. So there's lots of ways to improve this. I think because you're so far through it, it can be a bit annoying to come back and fix everything. But I think you'll find if you switch up any repetition in your trims and your texture, the actual materials themselves, just like removing a bit of noise and staggering any of your asset silhouettes where there's repetition. For example, this 8-pack here, and just toning down noise anywhere where you see too much leather, to be honest. With leather, the effect really comes out in the surface shine. So let the height map be very subtle and then let the shine do all the work. And that's how it feels like a nice wet leather. And then when you want to roughen it up, then you can pick and choose certain areas on the mesh just to give that level of variance. I'd say as well on the head's looking really cool here. So there's a nice separation of like the details going into the curvature. I'd say I've done a lot of these tusks in my time for creating creatures. What I'd like to see is some darkening. There's loads of interesting textures on the bone. And so some like dark areas on the tips, and definitely don't let the center inner areas rest too much. So it'd be nice to see a bit of grunge or design in there just to take away from the fake CG look of it. Also, don't be scared to go back in Substance and add some height maps. So you can add some even more granular texture, maybe some dots of where the bone spurs have been coming out. That's going to look very nice on a texture. And then you can basically support that with a color or a roughness map. And just coming back to the character, I'm really starting to think about this one. If this was sort of like a character art meeting, what I would suggest and how we would adapt this up is basically try and introduce some kind of color variance. And what I feel like it's screaming out for is like a red paint or something. I think like if it was crossed all over here, like it wasn't dabbled or it had some like lines on it, and wherever there was areas of bones, there's just like this insignia. I think that would break up the repetition of this as well. Same with these spikes. Maybe we can make these a lighter color. so they pop out from the surface, and maybe there's like a pattern that's beneath them and they're a lot darker, or there's like mud on them. So yeah, I think some sort of like red battle paint would look quite cool here, and it would definitely make the head pop up, because right now the head is getting lost in a lot of the noise basically. Okay, next up we have Rishab, and you've been working on some anatomy and sculpting practice, and it seems you've been focusing a lot on the female characters. So I like the progress that you've made so far. I've been following to see your characters get better each time. So it's really good that you're actually coming in and putting in the hours for actually training. So in terms of feedback for this sculpt, I believe you are trying to basically match the quality of this character. So this is a very high quality sculpt, to be honest. So it's a good metric to go by. So the first thing I see in your anatomy, and it happens a lot with characters when you're first starting out, is a flat front of face. So if I draw this sort of shape, you'll potentially see what I mean. And when you're sculpting from the front, sculpting from the side, this is a really common occurrence. And just basically this surface is very, very flat. So if we look on the character itself, you actually wouldn't be able to draw any sort of flat surface here. You'd have to come off to the side, and it's almost like a diamond shape. But basically from the top, what's happening is a lot of this geometry is wrapping around and being quite smooth. So in your example, what you would get is just get the move brush around this sort of area and just pull it all the way back. So for example, these areas can come to about here, and this can come to about here. And the same with the eyes, because everything seems to be falling forwards a bit. And you see that most evidently with the distance from the ear and the eye. So that's just getting a bit too separated. Next area that I see around here is basically the top of the eye and how that transitions back into the skull. So I think you've done well here to have the shelf of the lower eyelid, but when it gets to the top, it basically follows off in this direction, when in fact it should be curling back a little bit more. Obviously, it depends on the character and the reference, but what I would like to see is this come back and then just a visual support of the brow, and we can eat into it. So we can see on the reference how they've sort of done it. You can see it here. The way I like to think about it is obviously we have the eyeball underneath there, and then we just have these panels, almost like Pac-Man closers or like guards that come back over the eye. And then you can see that double hinge transition of the eyeball. So that's basically what was missing. I think maybe what happened with your sculpt is that you saw this silhouette and then accidentally transferred it onto the top of the eye. So for example, the silhouette can be correct, but it's just being pulled out a little bit too far. So the next difference that I would observe is an improvement on the lips. So we'll make some space on this character here. So this is a common occurrence, and that's actually really hard to achieve in sculpting, but that's making space in between the lips and making space around the lips. So here you can see everything feels quite tight. So whenever you're looking at a character, this is what I do, is like, how is it feeling? It's looking very, very tight and taut. So to make improvements of that, just make observations on characters of how much physical and space is inside of here. So if you look at these lips, it's almost like you could put, I don't know, like a bit of chewing gum there and it would rest. That's how much space is in there. Or they could, for example, like hold a pen in their lips. Think about that. So if I draw over this surface, you can see the curvature and how it's opening up and being nice and broad. Where on this one, it's looking very tight. So it goes flat and then it curls in really quickly. So you just want to open this up, and that'll be using something like a move topological, and potentially just adding a little bit more clay around in this direction. So if I was sculpting on this, I'd want to be sculpting along these flow lines, and then it's going to add a little bit more bulk to the character there because she's lost it a little bit. The next enhancement I'd like to see is around the area of the nose, and it's because of the outer nose ring is getting confused with the inner nose rings. These are almost the same sort of shape. If you see, I've drawn over it there. Now on the reference, I don't know if you're trying to match the reference, but the nose is nice and complicated. So we have these different curvatures. So that's the outer line. And then the inner line is actually a completely different shape. So if you manage to match these silhouettes, like even draw on top of them, to be honest, you can see here where I'm trying to draw the lines, and you can see how it looks different from every single angle. And that's one of the difficulties with the nose, from the front, the side angles, they all look different. So when you're sculpting, I would never suggest sculpting from a side view with the nose. You want to be rotating around it as much as possible. So introduce those lines that we did You know, for example, we have that flick and then it curls downwards. And then we're going to enhance this loop so it's coming back a little bit more. And it's just a restructuring of the nose. Obviously, everyone has different noses, but I think if you're trying to match this reference, that's how we would definitely do it. Okay, so next we also have the reference you were doing here. So likeness obviously is like a really hard one to do. I think initially what's happening is her forehead is looking a little bit elongated. So it's always a bit of a tricky one when there's no hair because it can be a bit of an illusion. So the proportions that I'm looking at straight away, I also see that the ear's connection to the head is really high to where it should be. So right now it's floating around about here. So the top of the ear is roughly along the eyebrow line towards the border of the brow. But I think the mistake you've done here is you've made the connection too high. So I'd like to see the connection transfer like this and then the ear come outwards like that. Again, everyone has different ears, but very rarely do you see that. So we'll have a nice separation of head and ear, and then that's going to add to the proportions. I think with this character as well, this character or this human, she has a very squared jaw and it almost comes in different stages. So you can see the points that I'll be drawing here. So there's one here, and then we've got a specific width. And I think that's being a little bit lost on this. And it might be because this area is getting quite pinched inwards and we're losing a little bit of the silhouette. So try and really ace the angle there. Maybe open up the chin in this direction. And then we're going to get a little bit closer to what she has here. Another thing that I see, and this is a very difficult one, it's probably because you've been led by the reference. And whenever someone is wearing makeup, it's to purposely to disguise parts of their face. So for example, with normal characters, we have some really nice forms here that are hidden in the reference. So they can sometimes throw you off. So the one that's being lost is the separation of the cheek and the under eye. I really want to see an internal line here, even if it's really, really subtle, everyone has it. So just enhance it that. And also at the same time, what's happening are the cheekbone area has dropped quite a lot. So you can see it from the side and we just want these to be a little tiny bit higher and then poking out over here. It's actually something I saw on this character as well. So if you look at this top character, she has a very prominent cheekbone and it comes out very close to the top of the eye. So it is quite high. Now remember where that reference is in comparison to the top of her brow. She got a very full face. And if we look at it here, it's somewhat missing. So I'd like to see the reintroduction of a bigger cheekbone and it coming out. And that's going to round the face. So you'll have a combination of moving the cheekbones back and also moving them up a bit and just making like a little bit more fullness. And doing that will correct a lot of things with that sculpt, basically. So I'll continue to go, I can forever see so many things. So basically, you've done very well on the neck here in comparison to what you had on the original. So I'd like to see that basically transferred onto what you did up here. The neck always adds to the character and how the head is sitting on the shoulders. But yeah, the throat and the neck is looking much better in terms of its flow. Now, the final thing as well, and it's the same on the other character, is just the tightness of the lips. So when we're working on the lips, they have a habit of shrinking. So what you want to do is think about the converse of that. So think about the lips expanding and always trying to make it bigger. It's always easier to make them smaller than it is to make it bigger. So start big and then make them come down. But in terms of the internal shapes, you've done pretty well. Like it's pretty close to the character. She's probably got a little bit more fullness in her lips in comparison to the sculpt. But the difficulty with lip sculpting is you can't put fullness in the lips unless you have enough space for it opening up. So once you open up all this space, you can then make the lips fuller and then it will translate better to the reference. Okay, next we have Brian. I'll definitely try and fit you in. I didn't have a chance to add it to the references on the Sunday deadline. So you're looking for as much feedback as you get. The reference is really cool. These are always fun to basically practice on. What I would observe with these types of characters is look how deep their facial features are. So her eyes are really deep set and there are all these sub shapes, whether it's in her scarring or the shape of her eyebrow and stuff like that. So when I look at the sculpt, I think the first thing that's missing is a midpoint between the primary forms and the details that you've put in. So I'd actually be interested to see a version of this that doesn't have the poor details. So you want to keep the board details back for as long as possible. Ideally in the feedback stages, get feedback on the primary form first, and then we can move on to secondary form. And that's because I think a lot of the secondary form is actually missing in here. So I'll just drag it in here quickly. So one way to really identify where those shapes are is just look at the shadows. So for example, this area of the character, you can see it's very, very dark and deep set. And basically, if you're not seeing that in your ZBrush, then you definitely want to go much, much deeper. So this is the nice things about highlights and shadows. As long as you match them from the reference, you basically get the sculpt that you're looking for. So for you, you're going to go really deep inside of here and make these eyes deep set. And it's same with the eyelids. The eyelids seem to be blending a little bit too smoothly back into the head. But when we look at the reference, you can almost see these as separate objects, almost like the bottom eyelid is almost its separate object and the top eyelid is a separate object. So it's actually a technique I do. Sometimes I get the eyeball and then I'll extract some clay from that so it's following the eye perfectly. I think it's on a video or remembers video somewhere, but that gives us a perfect separation. And it means you don't get the effect of like it blending too smoothly. So to repair this, you can do a couple of things. I would say for you to get a big damn standard brush and make it really gentle and really large. And then you just keep on stroking in directions around the eye. And what you'll find is that starts to push the eye back into the head. And then you can build up more clay back on top of it. So what we're really looking for is the second forms to come back out. And you can see it with the character fullness of the sculpt as well. So, sorry, the 2D reference. So you can almost draw lines on here so we can see some specific shapes, like her chin's got this kind of like octagonal look. The bottom of her chin is very squared off. You just basically want to reinterpret those back into the sculpt here. If you look at her bottom lip, it's almost supported by this cylindrical shape that goes in this direction. And when people are making characters, they often miss this out. So imagine this sort of shape coming upwards towards the bottom of the lip and try and reintroduce it here. So it's a little bit flat. You just enhance it. Then on either side, you can go really deep with a damn standard, and that's going to push and pull the lips out. And then again, also be really confident with creating that shape that you see in the 2D concept. Trim dynamics like really good for that to get your initial shapes out. And then with scarring, this is a really common one with students is basically, get the damn standard and then draw the scar in. Don't be afraid to really spend some time here and make it its own sort of asset. There's loads of individual shapes inside of those. So sometimes they look a little bit like that from the side. Sometimes they have different angles. So a trim dynamic is a really good one. You basically want to get rid of this softening effect, have it with different depths, maybe have some scar tissue on the outside, but spend a lot of time just like refining that and almost hiding the fact that you've used the damn standard is a good metric to go by. Proportionally, I would say there's some edits that can be done with the size of the hat. So the hat and how it's positioned on the head, this one's very loose and wide in comparison. So you just want to tighten this up so it matches a lot better. And as a general rule of thumb, if you look at her face, it's very elongated in comparison to the one that you've done. So for hers, it's looking a little bit more squared and crystalline, whereas hers is very, very long. And it's a continuation of the hat shape as well. And then after you've done those shapes, sort of like elongating the face, then we can start to see how much room the hair is taking up. So if you look at the hair and how much it's poking out of the silhouette, it's actually not that much when in comparison what we've got here is quite a lot of hair silhouette. So that's how you would basically match it a lot better to the original concept. Okay, so that, guys, is the feedback. Don't forget to come in and ask your questions for next month in terms of anything to do with games, or if you want to see a very specific video. I also highly suggest coming into the works in progress and actually giving your own feedback to other people. So no matter what level you're at, there's always someone that could use a little bit of feedback or maybe a couple of steps behind from when you first started out. And it's a really good habit to get into. So what I say is give feedback to someone who's a couple of steps below you, give feedback to someone who's a couple of steps above you, and then also give feedback to someone who's about on your level. And those three in combination will just really excel your sculpting, your games procedures, and just get your mind thinking about this entire industry. So keep up good work, and I'll catch you on the next one.